So good evening. Welcome to part two of our four-part program looking at the history of women in the rabbinate. You can't see it very well. I did say last week that I would try each week to wear a different piece of Women's Rabbinic Network swag. So this is this week's. It's my casual look. It's the sweatshirt, The Journey to 50, which was the name of this convention this year, because we are on our journey towards 50 years since Sally Priesand was ordained a rabbi. And tonight we're going to learn a little bit about Sally. I'm going to focus less on her story, though, than that of another important figure in our history, partly because we have an opportunity to hear about Sally's life and experience firsthand from her in just a few weeks, November the 18th. That Nancy and the Sisterhood have been communicating and organizing that program. So there'll be a separate link for that. We'll be getting information out about that probably next week, just to start making sure people are really aware of that wonderful opportunity. So tonight, before we get to the first of the two women we're going to focus on, I wanted to bring up something that I have to say, I'm learning so much with the materials that were compiled for this course, moments in history that I didn't necessarily know about, quite aside from some of the individuals who I might not have known so much about. And I know the three individuals that we discussed last week were all new to you. But I'm going to start with a piece of an article, and I'm going to put it up on screen. And before I go to screen share, is there somebody who would be comfortable reading a couple of pages of text off the screen for me? If I can just see who that's going to be. Thank you, Elaine. So if you want to unmute yourself, and I'm going to put this up. So this is just today, the course is covering Scouts, Trailblazers, Pathfinders, Explorers. We did the Scouts last week. This week we're on to the Trailblazers. We'll be looking at Rabbi Regina Jonas and Rabbi Sally Priesand. So this is the first text. Over to you, Elaine.
On June 29, 1922, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, CCAR, the Reform Movement's professional organization, meeting in Cape May, New Jersey, debated a resolution declaring that, quote, women cannot justly be denied the privilege of ordination as rabbis, end quote. After tabling the resolution overnight, the conference voted 56-11 on June 30 to affirm in principle the right of women to become rabbis. The debate, notable for its invitation to the women present, mainly rabbis' wives, to participate in the discussion, may have been successful in changing some minds. The New York Times reported on the morning of June 29 that the majority of conference attendees were opposed to the resolution, but on June 30, the same newspaper reported that, quote, the sentiment was seemingly largely in favor of the entry of women, unquote. The Cape May resolution was inspired indirectly by the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, and directly by Martha Newmark, a 17-year-old student at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, who that same year asked to be assigned, like her male rabbinical student classmates, to a high holiday student pulpit. Her request raised the possibility that Newmark, daughter of an HUC faculty member, might ultimately present herself as a candidate for ordination. When the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote, it aroused an expectation among at least some Americans that all barriers to women's full equality in American society would subsequently fail. Reform Judaism, which had already instituted many changes meant to bring Judaism into accord with the spirit of the times, and which had long advocated women's equality, might have been expected to drop barriers to women's full participation. The rabbi's resolution, in fact, noted the revolution in the status of contemporary women and explained the vote as an acknowledgement of the enrichment and enlargement of congregational life, which had grown out of women's contributions. Despite the CCR resolution, Newmark was never ordained. The college's governing board voted in February 1923 to bar female ordination, indicating that there did not seem to be any practical need for such a step. Newmark eventually withdrew from HUC, having completed 7.5 years of the 9-year curriculum. Although other women would study at HUC over the years, some completing the rabbinical curriculum and many earning other degrees, no woman in the United States would be ordained as a rabbi until 1972, when Sally Priesand became the first, 50 years after the CCR first resolved to make it possible. Wow.
Wow, indeed. Right? So yeah, these organizations, different parts of the reform movement have their own boards, have their own processes, and the movement as well, the rabbinic umbrella organization, the CCAR, that's specifically just the umbrella organization for the rabbis, made this vote. Hebrew Union College, which at that time was separate from the Jewish Institute of Religion. They were two different organizations that later merged as one. So the full title these days of the college is HUCJIR. They made a different vote. And then, of course, there's the umbrella organization for the congregations themselves. The Union of American Hebrew Congregations is what it was for many years, UAHC. And that got changed to the Union for Reform Judaism, URJ, a number of years ago, not that long ago, since I've been a rabbi. Was that news to most of you here, that we had a vote in this country? Seeing nodding of heads. Reactions, responses. What does it, how do you feel sort of having heard that piece of history reviewed and read? Sorry, go ahead.
I really have forgotten that part, but it just strikes me that the suffragette movement also took like 50 or more years from the beginnings of the suffragette movement till women finally had the right to vote. And here, reform movement also took this 50-year gap, but usually Jews are like ahead of the game. And in this case, we were behind the game.
Well, behind the game compared to the right to vote, and if you, but those are not comparing exactly like things. Certainly, when it came to the ordination of women, we were. I apologize. I do not remember what year the first Christian minister was ordained as a woman, but it was in the 70s. It's very much it's within a year or two of Sally, I believe. Iris, go ahead. Iris, if you meant to raise your hand, please unmute, because we're not hearing you at the moment.
Took me forever because I'm doing 10 million things at the same time. Sorry about that. Basically, if you think about it, we are ahead of the game, because if you think about 1972, the first rabbi, when was the first woman senator? If you compare it to that, you don't have to compare it necessarily to the vote, because the vote was before that. So you have to compare apples to apples, and we still didn't have a first president. And it gives me hope for Roe versus Wade, because while that was in the 70s, maybe in 2022, we'll have a law and abortion rights, stuff like that. So maybe so that's how I think about it.
Thank you. Karen and Gordon.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on the fact that it's been almost 50 years since Sally Priesand till the first female president of the CCAR is Hera Person, is it not? Have there been other?
No, there's two different roles. There's the executive director of the CCAR. That's
Okay.
Hara.
Okay.
But we actually next week we'll look at a kind of a timeline of a lot of firsts. And the first woman who was president of the CCAR, as opposed to executive director, was earlier. I want to say late 80s, like maybe
Okay.
88 or something like that. I may be wrong. It may be later. It may be the 90s. We'll look at the timeline together, because some of those firsts are surprising. Things that you might expect to have happened earlier happen later. Things that you might have expected to have taken longer happened earlier. But that's the beginning of next week's session. So
She's the first
yeah.
female executive director.
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Any other reactions to this first little piece of history before we move on? Oh, Elaine put something in the chat. Did you look that up for us? Oh gosh, Universalists, 1825. Well, the Universalists have been ahead of their time on all kinds of topics, actually. So, but that's quite remarkable. Yeah, yeah. Marcia, go ahead.
Just to follow through with Iris, one of the first, not the first, but one of the first U.S. female congresswomen was Elizabeth Nurse Rogers. And coincidentally, yes, probably an ancestor of ours, but she was the person who who put forth and was really championing for a bill to bring more Holocaust survivors into the United States. And her entire bill was basically rejected in the late 1930s. But that was really a first. She wasn't Jewish, I don't think. Mm-hmm. But, following through with what Iris said, we did have female congresswomen in the 1920s.
Right. Wow. Well, thank you. So yeah, so we can see the sort of the change. It's very interesting. The language that was used by HUC was that they didn't see the need. They didn't argue against it in principle or from the basis of some kind of halachic or Jewish argument. They didn't see the need. They were just about the right number of jobs for the men. We didn't need to be training women to step into these roles. That was sort of a part of the language that really struck me in that statement. But despite the journey towards eventual ordination of the first woman by a seminary here in the United States, Sally was not, in fact, the first woman to be ordained. And now, I should say something about ordination, just very briefly. Ordination is the English term we use. The traditional term is smicha, which is literally kind of the laying of hands, the transferring of title from one rabbi to another. And even today, in the ceremony of ordination, the way that we are ordained by Hebrew Union College, it is done by one person who's been given that role on faculty, who will we come up one at a time in front of an open ark, and they lay their hands and they recite something, and they bestow, they smicha, they ordain us in that moment. So before there were seminaries, that would happen individually on an individual basis. There would be yeshivot, places where people would study, and they would study until they had gained usually expertise, often in a traditional setting, expertise in like one particular area of Jewish law. Just like we have today, lawyers who, those who specialize in different areas of the law. Nobody's expected to sort of absolutely be an absolute expert in every area of secular law. So it is in Judaism. So they would study, they would eventually focus in and become a particular expert in one thing, but have good general knowledge of Jewish law. And at a certain point, they would be they would get smicha, that one of the rabbis who was teaching at the yeshiva would, lay the hands and bestow the title on their student. So I just want you to kind of have that as being that's how it happens, so that when we're looking at the history here, will understand some of the nuance between an individual ordination and an institutional ordination, where it's gone through the sort of the path of a seminary, which takes a step sort of beyond the yeshiva context, and we're now in a more of a college setting, something that's a more modern style institution. So with that, let's go now to learn about the first that we know of. Rabbi Regina Jonas. Rabbi Regina Jonas, you can maybe tell from the way I'm pronouncing her name, was from Germany. And I'm going to come back to the slide share a little bit later. What I'd like to do is give you a little bit of biography about her, and then from there we'll go to a little bit of video and a little bit of other information. So just to give you a little bit of the history. As far as we know, Regina Jonas was in fact the first woman to be ordained as a rabbi, where a rabbi laid their hands and gave her smicha and gave her the title of rabbi. For many, many years, we knew nothing about her. Even in the 1970s, when Sally Priesand was ordained, and a couple of years later in the UK, the first woman, Jackie Tabak, 1974, 75, I think, was ordained. There was maybe some whisper or rumor about a possibility, but people really didn't know anything about this woman. And yet, for at least a couple of years, and probably more than that, she performed full rabbinic functions. Specifically, we know that she did that from 1942 to 44 at Theresienstadt. She was murdered in Auschwitz in October 1944. And it wasn't until the coming down of the Berlin Wall that we really learned more about her. Miraculously, a small collection of her writings and papers had been collected and were in an archive, but they were in East Germany. And when the wall came down, this came to light. And so people have started to research and find out about her. What's somewhat remarkable, and we may have our thoughts and feelings about this, is that there are people who did survive the war, who you may well have heard of, who knew her, who heard her, who worked with her, and who after the war never, as far as we know, spoke about her or told people about her or said to anyone, do you know we already ordained a woman as a rabbi? Among them, Rabbi Leo Beck. Leo Beck College in London is named for him. Leo Beck School in Haifa is named for him. And psychoanalyst Viktor Frankl. And so in 1972, when Sally Priesand was ordained, most people were referring to her as the first ever female rabbi. And that's all people knew until that record was corrected with this information. And Sally herself, since that information has come to light, has been very good at championing the story of Regina Jonas and making sure that people understand that, in fact, Sally is not the very, very first. So just a little bit of background, because if you think about the three women we studied last week, I gave you a little bit of like, who were they? Where did they come from? What kind of family were they born into? You know, why did they end up taking on the roles that they did, even though those women never officially got the title of rabbi? You know, they certainly functioned very much with many of the functions of rabbis at a moment in time, in their time. So thinking about those opportunities, those contexts, and maybe some of those barriers, you know, those questions that we looked at last week, we can apply that as we listen to the story of Regina Jonas. So she was born in Berlin in 1902. And she grew up in a fairly poor, but mostly Jewish neighborhood. Her father was a merchant, died when she was very young. He died in 1913 of tuberculosis. He was probably her first teacher. And we know that Regina had a draw towards the rabbinic vocation pretty early on in her life. She loved learning Jewish history and Bible and Hebrew at high school at a time when, people who knew her from then recalled her talking about becoming a rabbi. There were people, as she started to want to move in that direction, who supported the journey that she was on and her interests, including Orthodox rabbis. And some of these modern Orthodox rabbis were quite open with regard to how they thought about the religious education of girls. So, for example, one in particular, Max Whale, often officiated at the Reicherstrasse synagogue, where Regina's mother, along with her two children, she had one boy and one girl, would regularly attend. And until he was deported to Theresienstadt, Whale and Jonas would meet once a week in order to study rabbinic literature, the Talmud, Shulchan Aruch, and texts. She passed various exams. She got into a teacher's seminar and was, as often the case for Jewish women at that moment in time, the path that they would go on would be to be educated in order to be Jewish education teachers. And that's what she started with. But in 1924, she matriculated at the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums. And the only reason I can say that is because at Leo Beck College in London, we very much saw that college and the style of education at Leo Beck in London as the inheritor of the Hochschule's style of rabbinic education. So that's one name that I got drummed into me. So that was a seminary. That was a modern style seminary for, and we didn't have necessarily big different denominations at this point, but they were very much on the leading edge of reform. That seminary was founded in Berlin in 1872, and it was very liberal. It admitted women as students. But as I said, most of them were studying for a teacher's degree. And Yonas is the only one that we are aware of who had expressed the desire to achieve ordination as a rabbi. Edward Bannis was a professor of Talmud there, and he was responsible for rabbinic ordinations. And he supervised her final thesis, which dealt with the topic. The question of her thesis was, may a woman hold rabbinic office? And we have a copy of that document. That was one of the documents that was found in the archives, and we have her thesis. And it is known to be the first, as far as we know, halachic based argument for why women should and could be ordained as rabbis. And she combined, the use and analysis of Jewish law along with modern attitudes, but different to what we might see as the style of contemporary Reform Judaism, particularly, let's say, in the United States at that time, where, if you read early Jewish legal responsa from the Reform movement in America, they would often do great historical research about all of the early rabbinic sources and what the legal codes said about a question. And then in the last paragraph, they would say, but we live in different times and we don't do that anymore. And that would be their sort of, we're going to do things differently. That was very much the sort of, frontier attitude of Reform Judaism in America. But in Germany, or at least the way that Regina looked at this, she grounded everything in these rabbinic texts. She looked very closely at what texts could be found, what they said, what they didn't say, and she presented her case on the basis of that. On the opening page of her thesis, she writes, I personally love this profession, and if ever possible, I also want to practice it. And on the last page, she concludes, almost nothing halachically but prejudice and the lack of familiarity stand against women holding rabbinic office. Now, if you look at the rabbinic halachic sources, there's nothing that ever explicitly directly addresses the question of women's ordination. So she couldn't point to something that direct, but she could look at women who'd held rabbinic functions. And we talked about a couple last week, but she also looked at Bruria and her scholarship in the Talmud. She looked at Yalta, the Hasmonean queen, Salome Alexandra, and also, and some of you have read the novels by Maggie Anton, Rashi's daughters and granddaughters, who were all involved in halachic decision-making and were all educated by their fathers. And so that's some of the material that she looks at. She points out that where you can find sources that say negative things about women and women's leadership, you can find other sources in the same rabbinic texts that say positive things about women's leadership. And she says, and you can do exactly the same when you look at the men who were leaders in the Talmud. There's positive things that are said about them and negative things. And so she balances these things out and puts them in a different context. One of the things that she does talk about, and this is maybe a little bit of a variance as to how we might look at this through modern eyes, is she deals with the issue of modesty. There's a lot written in rabbinic tradition about modesty. Is it modest for women to take the lead? If there are men who are knowledgeable and educated and know the liturgy and can lead the prayers, is it appropriate? Is it modest for women to step up and do that? And so she does talk about the expectations on women to lead through values such as humility and restraint and morality. And in fact, in her opinion, a female rabbi should not marry. That was one of those things, looking at the roles of women and their obligations, that was something that she proposed. But she said that every woman should be free to decide whether or not they want a life as a mother or a profession according to their skills. And they should be guided to do that which they are skilled and able to do. She also felt that in modern times, it was particularly fitting for women to become rabbis because there were certain qualities that were more associated with women. And again, these are generalizations, but this is how she was arguing at the time. Things like compassion, social skills, psychological intuition, that she felt meant that women in the rabbinate were a cultural necessity. I think that's a very interesting way that she explained that in her writing, in her thesis, that women in the rabbinate would be a cultural necessity because of these qualities. Something just to hold on to, because when we get to next week's session and we hear from Rabbi Hakin and we look at in the final session, some of the kinds of impacts that women in the rabbinate have had over the last 50 years, it will be interesting to sort of bear in mind what she said about that particular thing. So as we kind of just move through her story a little bit more, unfortunately, her teacher, Edward Bannis, died. And his successor, who did survive the war, Hanoch Albeck, he lived until 1972. Very interesting that this man died in 1972, just purely coincidental. He was unwilling to ordain a woman. And none of the other professors at that time at the Hochschule raised their voices. They didn't want a scandal. They didn't want to push against his authority. And so as a result, Regina graduated only with the religious teacher qualification. And in the following years, she taught at several girls' schools in Berlin, and she was known to be a very popular and committed teacher, again, from those who had direct experience of her. In 1933, the workload for Jewish teachers went up enormously because students had to leave public schools because of anti-Semitism and laws that were brought in. And so they needed these teachers and their knowledge to be working. But Despite continuing to work as a teacher, Jonas continued to pursue ordination. And finally, in 1935, Rabbi Max Dienemann, and he lived, unfortunately, only to 1939. He was the executive director of the Conference of Liberal Rabbis. So this is interesting because we started with that piece of information about how the Conference of American Rabbis agreed in principle to the ordination of women, even though the college would not permit it in the 1920s. So here we are in 1935, that even though she didn't get ordination from the Hochschule, from the college officially, the executive director of the Conference of Liberal Rabbis agreed to her ordination. And she got a diploma of ordination that reads, "Since I saw that her heart is with God and Israel, and that she dedicates her soul to her goal, and that she fears God, and that she has passed the examination in matters of religious law, I herewith certify that she is qualified to answer questions of religious law and entitled to hold the rabbinic office. And may God protect her and guide her on all her ways." So you can tell by the year we're in, unfortunately, she didn't get very many years to practice as a rabbi. In 1937, in Berlin, she became employed officially as a rabbinic pastoral counselor, working in many of the welfare institutions for the Jewish community. She officiated regularly at the Jewish hospital. As many rabbis had either been imprisoned or had gotten out of the country, there was also a need for these rabbinic voices of those who remained. And so she did start to preach at the more liberal synagogues in Berlin. There was a group of regulars from the famous Neue Synagogue, which was a flagship synagogue of German Jewry, and they had her preach at Havdalah services in the weekday synagogue. She lectured to groups of Witzo and sisterhoods and Jewish lodges. And so this is what we know about the work she was able to do in Berlin. As I mentioned, she was eventually taken in 1942 to Theresienstadt. And there we know she worked as a rabbi. She preached, she counseled. There are people who remember hearing her, were inspired by her. There is, in fact, a secret synagogue in the grounds of Theresienstadt, in the darkness. It's quite remarkable that there was even a space that people would go for some kind of prayer service. And officially, where she was working was in the area of Theresienstadt that was led by Viktor Frankl. And this is why we know that Viktor Frankl knew exactly who she was, but yet seems never to have spoken about her after the war. Both she and her mother were deported to Auschwitz on October 12th, 1944. And as far as we know, they were most likely killed on the same day. What we have among her papers, aside from her thesis, is we have some of her lectures. In the archives at Theresian, there is a handwritten document that summarizes her religious worldview and her legacy. Under the title Lectures by the Only Female Rabbi, Regina Jonas, it lists 24 topics for lectures, followed by notes on the sermon that she delivered in Theresian. So that's some of what we've gathered. There's a wonderful rabbi in Germany, Elisa Klaphek, who put together this research. This is a summary of what she's done. She's written a whole book and really researched the archives and shared this remarkable story of Regina. So I'm going to pause for a moment because there are others who have gone and explored her story, and I would like to share a short video with you of their journey to discover the life of Regina Jonas. But before I do, that was just a lot of overview of her history. Questions, responses, just thoughts about this woman. How many of you had heard of Regina Jonas before? Okay. A few hands. I hope so, because I've talked about her. I've given at least a couple of sermons over the 9 years. And actually, you saw the date she died is in October. We don't have exact, but Parshat Bereshit has been now officially kind of assigned as a Shabbat to talk about her. I haven't done that every year. It depends on where things fall and what else is going on. So I did not do that this year, partly because I knew I was going to be teaching this course. But I have talked about her once or twice at the congregation. Any question? Yes, Elaine, go ahead.
So the three women we learned about last week, if I remember correctly, they were all daughters of rabbis. Or were they not?
One of them
No?
was not. The maid of Ludmir was the daughter of a merchant. Yeah, she
Oh,
didn't have
okay.
that kind of yichus. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
and Ray Frank, I think, had some rabbinic yichus in her history, but not her father.
okay, so maybe not a father-daughter, but there were, except for that one, two of them did have something in their past, in their family history, in their history of rabbis. And so I can kind of see how that might be passed down. But Regina had none of that. You said her father died early?
Yeah, he
Right.
was a merchant, and he died when she was,
He was young, like she was
young.
7.
She was like 11 years old or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
something like that. So was there anyone else, or was there anyone in her family who may have given her that desire to learn more about you? Do we know? I'm just curious, because it seems like that might be a possibility.
Not that I know of from the articles that I've read. Those who have researched, her more in more depth may have information. It seems to me, though, from what I have read, that her inspiration came from her learning, from being a student in school. Sometimes we get inspired by members of, or encouraged by members of our family. Sometimes we have a teacher who just lights a fire in us, and we love a particular topic, and we want to learn it and study it and make a career out of whatever that is. And I think that was more her path. And clearly she had the support of these inspirational men, some of whom were, maybe, very liberal Orthodox, but nevertheless, Orthodox oriented rabbis who were happy to teach her and study with her and teach her Jewish law, and gave her that foundation. So, but clearly it was the fire within her that wanted that she was seeking that out from a pretty young age. Yeah. Yes, Karen, please go ahead.
So I know, because I just looked it up, that Leo Beck died in 1956, but Frankel didn't die until 1997. Did anybody have a chance to talk to him about why he chose to keep the information secretive?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I do not know the answer whether anybody ever brought it up directly to him. And of course, the question is, was it secretive, or was it just, not, he wasn't working specifically in rabbinic seminary fields. He wasn't engaged directly in the conversation about women becoming rabbis. Is it just in the life of, through his lens, through his eyes, this was not a significant piece of history in the way that it is to us. I mean, I think, all of us, particularly women, but we get excited by, oh my goodness, she lived, she existed. This is, there's a legacy here. For those of us who are women who are rabbis, there's an enormous pride in feeling that she is our intellectual ancestor. And how incredible she was to do what she did at that moment in time. But it just maybe didn't, I think it's an interesting question as to whether it was an intentional omission, or whether it was just, the lens through which someone who's in a position of power and authority, and, and just takes certain things for granted through a male lens, perhaps
I
just
mean, the other
thinking
thing
much of it.
I was thinking about, I mean, and certainly in my own experience in being a physician, I can tell you dozens and dozens of times that no matter how many times people actually intellectually might have known that I was a physician, I was always called a nurse. And I mean, many people. So I'm thinking that, even though, Frankel and Beck and many others knew that she was a rabbi because she was functioning as a rabbi, they may have still seen her as teacher. And they, it just may never have crossed their mind that such a thing was possible.
Possibly. Yeah, very possibly. So as I said, she has, left this remarkable legacy, and learning about her has been very inspirational to many women. So I want to play for you a short excerpt. It's just 10 minutes of a very short documentary that is about the journey of a group of women rabbis, many of them who were leaders, firsts, significant members of our contemporary community, who traveled to Germany and to Theresian to learn more about her. And this was back, I think this was in 2014. I think the documentary, when I play it, says that. So I'm going to share this with you. We're going to take 10 minutes with this, and then we'll have some time to talk about the response of these other women to learning about Regina Jonas. So let's make sure we share sound this time. Learned my lesson from last week, and hopefully everyone can hear and see this.
Regina Jonas had the passion and the desire to become a rabbi when it was completely new. She faced a lot of antagonism. She had no role models. They were all men, and yet there was something inside of her that moved her forward.
People made such a fuss about us of how did you possibly imagine that you could be a rabbi, and it wasn't possible. So now that I learned that she was born in 1902 and as an 11-year-old discerned that she was supposed to be a rabbi. 1913 in Germany. What an absolutely remarkable story, regardless of the rest of the story.
Well, I think one of the great gifts of feminism is discovering all these stories that have been hidden away for so long. And Regina Jonas is one of those people we should have known about.
And here she lived when she was already officiating as a teacher and preacher, a rabbinical.
I think Regina Jonas changes how we think about Jewish history to recognize that the first woman who became a rabbi here in Berlin in December of 1935. It shifts the kind of narrative that we tell about feminism. It makes the post-war feminist movement, which we associate very much with the United States, actually to have roots that go back further.
This is it. This is her whole life in a box.
I think the most powerful moment for me was when we were with the archivist and you could see Regina Jonas' papers. And there weren't very many of them. But in some sense, it appears that she chose those papers. So in a way, she was creating how she wanted to be remembered.
And I told before that we don't know exactly how these papers got here. We think she gave them to the Jewish community before she was sent to Theresienstadt, so about in 1942. And then
we just have a fragment. We only have a fragment. But how wonderful that we do have that fragment.
We have the original ordination document, that letter, so to speak. And Leo Beck signs it, not signing the smicha, but signing that it's a true copy. which means he was doing some political, I think, some political balancing. He was the head of all of German Jewry, so he couldn't say, you know, I'm ordaining a woman in 35. This would have been problematic, but he took that step as far as he could. Nobody knowing about her, even though Leo Beck knew her and survived, and many other people knew her and survived, didn't talk about her. So this is kind of the weird... Right. Silencing women. For me, it's writing women out of history.
It's an evening of firsts in which we honor Regina Jonas, the first woman rabbi in modern times, and bring together for the very first time the pioneering rabbis who were the first to be ordained by their denominational seminaries.
I was always pleased that I wasn't really first, because I never wanted to be. So I knew that maybe there was a woman who had some form of ordination. We weren't sure of her name even, but the rumor was there.
I do a lot of speaking, and I always try to mention her, feeling that whenever we gather to talk about these kinds of subjects, we bring honor to her memory.
So many pilgrimages up mountains. Now at Terezin with Regina, a different pilgrimage on sanctified ground.
She was the pastor. She was the teacher. She was their rabbi. And to be in that place with other women rabbis, which are her legacy, was quite powerful to me.
This is from an article that she wrote in 1938. God has placed abilities and callings in our hearts without regard to gender. Thus, each of us has the duty, whether man or woman, to realize those gifts God has given. If you look at things this way, one takes woman and man for what they are, human beings.
The texts that she was looking at were the same texts that I had been thinking about in terms of finding support for female rabbis.
I believe that the question of whether a woman may make halachic decisions as a rabbiniran may very clearly be seen as permitted, and it is not necessary to continue to linger over this matter.
For a second, it was, could I have done what she did? No, I don't think I could have done what she did, but for a moment I had a glimpse of it because I was speaking her words.
The words on the plaque that come from one of her sermons that have somehow miraculously survived. To live that kind of a life, I think, makes her a symbol for all humanity.
It's a little bit like reconnecting with a long lost relative, older relative that I always should have known, who's part of my story, whom I had never even known about.
She ministered to people at a time of such grave crisis and inhumanity, and yet she not only kept her own spirits and faith going, she kept the faith going of those who were imprisoned there. That's what a rabbi does, is to try and offer hope in the darkest of times.
I just can't even believe that her papers were hidden away for 50 years and that nobody really talked about her. So I have to say to myself, was her story kept from us because she's a woman? And then I start to wonder about how many other stories have been kept from us.
Oh, remarkable, huh? Really remarkable. And it's a very just very moving for me, I think, to see all of the firsts from the various seminaries share their responses. I have a couple of questions that I want to sort of pose just to stimulate some conversation. And I think we'll stay in one group tonight. I was thinking about breakouts, but I think it's nice to stay together. So of course, if there's any questions you have or anything you found particularly surprising, please ask or comment on that. But I'd be interested to hear what was, if anything from that was particularly inspiring or moving to you as you listened to that short documentary. Yes, Barbara, please.
I was very moved by the group of women rabbis who walked in her footsteps, literally, to honor her. And I think that's quite amazing to me. And I just can't imagine how they felt. But I think visiting places can often connect you with people in ways that's different than learning or thinking or even writing about them. Just being where they were, I think is a holy thing. I was really very moved.
Yes, Elaine.
It was wonderful. Those 10 minutes, it could have gone on for a very long time and I still would have been moved. But one of the statements, I think it was made toward the end, was what else could have been hidden from us as far as women's history was concerned. I know there was a book that we read in our CBS book group that was about Jewish women in the United States, and from way back in colonial times, most of whom I had never heard of and certainly never learned about in regular public school or in Hebrew school for that matter. And it just made me stop and think about what don't we know and how fortunate we are to have the little bit that we do know about Regina Jonas. It was very moving.
Thank you. Yeah, Bunny.
I remember thinking many years ago during the high holidays wow, everybody in the world at this moment, we are all doing the same thing. We're all being exposed to the same words, the same rituals, and this has been going on, just that sense of power and identity and unity. And so watching this, my first reaction to your invitation was, there are no words. There are no words. It just leaves you filled with feelings of pride, and a sense of belonging and of connection and of gratitude and recognizing our legacy, the power of our history, and being proud of it.
Right. Yeah, to know it is, transforms not only how we read the past, but also things that we do in the present and maybe in the future. And Cheryl, I saw your hand. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, we didn't hear much about her struggles, whereas with some of the other women leaders, there was always the pressure to get married and to have kids and that. Do we know much about what type of societal pressures she was up against? I mean, I can imagine in Germany at that time, I don't know how she was not squished before, how the men didn't knock her down and say, get in your line,
I'm not a great historian. I mean, and like there are people, colleagues of mine who are much better read, in depth in terms of history. So I'm going to speak with sort of the humility of knowing that there's a lot that I don't know. But the impression that I have from that which I have studied over the years is that actually Germany in the 1930s was incredibly progressive in all kinds of ways. And in some way, I mean, we've seen it in this country, right? When there's been this, what felt like a big step forward in terms of sets of progressive values or the inclusion of people who were marginalized from society, there's then this backlash, right? We saw that, with the last administration. And the same happened in Germany. I mean, the Nazi regime came in, but 1930s Germany, I mean, it was a time of incredible strides in that moment. The movies, the culture of that time, was risque. It was quite open. The clubs, there was a vibrant gay and lesbian scene in its time. And there's a lot of questions in those communities about what would have happened if that trajectory had been allowed to continue. And so actually, I'm not sure that, the context for Regina's life was one in which she would have been, I mean, clearly there were still limitations. She was still groundbreaking. She was still a first. But there was a moment in time in Germany where there was possibility. And it took decades to get back to the kind of openness and the freedom that certain more marginalized groups had back in that time. And if others know more history than I do, I'd be happy to hear other comments or corrections on that. But that's my impression. Sherry.
Great.
Go ahead, Sherry.
I'm a little surprised. My mother was in Auschwitz in 1944. So it resonates for me as we talk about this. And I find it difficult to comprehend how she was able to do prayer groups in the context of the concentration camp, given what my knowledge is of what was going on in the concentration camps at that time. So I'm very interested in that piece of it.
Sure. So Theresian was very different. to Auschwitz. She didn't do it in Auschwitz. As far as we know, she died the day she got to Auschwitz. And Auschwitz would have been a very different context. Theresian was very different. Back in November 2019, I took a trip through Eastern Europe and was there. And in fact, I wanted to bring up for you, I have, because it didn't stay up on screen very long, the plaque for her, which I have a photo of from my visit. Theresian was very different. I mean, yes, it was terrible. A lot of people at Theresian died of starvation or dysentery and other kinds of conditions, but it wasn't a death camp. And there were kids making magazines. There was culture. There was art. There was music. There was they were a little bit more self-policed. There was a hierarchy within the prisoners, but there was a lot more possibility for these things to be taking place. It's just when you visit it and you walk around and you get to go into the museum, the context for Theresian is quite different. But you're absolutely right. In Auschwitz, it would have maybe been amongst a very small group of women in a particular bunk in a particular area. Would have been, there are stories of those kinds of moments of inspiration with lay people or rabbis, but nothing that would have been more communal than that. Yeah. Bunny, I'm sorry, did you want to add something before?
I was just commenting on the culture that you were referred to, like in the show Cabaret, when you see that kind of explosive, cutting edge, let loose behavior.
Right, exactly. So, I know that wasn't necessarily mainstream and everywhere, but certainly in Berlin, it was present. So, and we hear it even amongst, these were traditional rabbis, men who were encouraging and facilitating some of this possibility. So there was clearly an openness, this sense of, embracing the modern age in certain ways. One of the things that I started to mention just before that really strikes me, and having learned about her story, is, it does reframe what we think we know and how we know it. Because if we were going to tell us a history, tell the story of women's ordination in the rabbinate, and we just started with Sally Priesand in 1972, we would probably say this was a product of second wave feminism, right? It was all happening at that time. And this was the Jewish response to that. And it's not that that isn't an important context to what becomes possible in the 1970s, but it just, when you pull the lens back and you see, who was before and the foundations they set, even though we might not have consciously known about them, it changes the way we tell the history, which is what I love about this course that the WRM put together, because they got that, and they've made sure that those other foundational moments and those incredible women of the past, that we get to hold up their stories as well. Yeah, Carol, go ahead.
I got a calendar from the Holocaust Museum, and it talks about education against all odds, and it talks about a lot of women who taught Jewish school and that kind of thing. Now, they weren't rabbis, but they certainly were making sure that the faith was continued. So as far as not knowing what went on, there are things that we do know. They're just not really publicized.
Right. There are other histories, yes. And thank you. Was it LA mentioned a book? Thank you, Barbara, for bringing good books to the book club that lifts up some of these stories when we have opportunities to learn about them. Okay. Any other responses to what we've seen so far? I'm just keeping an eye on the time, and actually we have about 25 minutes, and I want to get to something about Sally Priesand. So I'll move on. Okay. I did want to just very briefly, as a kind of closure to this, I'm just going to move forward in a moment. I want just to put up one screen share for you. It's an angle because I was trying to not get too much of the reflection in, with the camera, but this is the plaque that we saw in the documentary. They were placing stones in a basket. It was just below this plaque. So I just wanted you to see what it actually had said here, that this plaque that was put in place, the quote, which was from her writings at the top, to be blessed by God means to give wherever one steps in every life situation, blessing, kindness, faithfulness, which is, I think, a wonderful quote to have selected as a legacy of what she was about. And here we have what this plaque now says. When you visit Theresian, the first woman rabbi in history spoke these words in a sermon at Theresian. And then it gives us the history, which I've covered. So just quite remarkable. Okay. Sally Priesand. So Sally, in many ways, her story in terms of what leads her to want to enter the rabbinate is not so different to what we heard about Regina Jonas in terms of her education and what she had a passion for. And as I said, I'm not going to give you the in-depth biography in quite the same way, because I want Sally to be able to tell her own story in her own words in a couple of weeks. But what I thought you might find interesting was at the point in which she started her correspondence with Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati to inquire about being accepted there for the rabbinic program, bearing in mind that back in the 1920s, the college said, we have no need to have women in the rabbinate, and did not permit. And so here we are now in the late the dialogue begins in the mid 1960s. So it's actually it's not a product of the 70s so much, even though she was ordained in 72. It's a 5-year program, and the correspondence starts much earlier. So, okay, can you see that? Did it jump with you? Do you see the letter? Yep, it's up on screen. Okay, I know it's small, so here we go. Make it a little bigger. So this is the first of the letters, 1963.
We can't see it.
You cannot? Okay, sorry. Thank you for saying something. It jumped to a different screen, so the screen share probably didn't travel with it. Okay, now you should be able to see it. Yes?
Yes.
Good, great. Thank you. Thanks, Karen, for speaking up. Okay, so June 17th, 1963. Would somebody like to read this instead of me? Just hear another voice. Yeah, Karen, go ahead. Let's read the first one.
Dear Miss Priesand, we are pleased to learn of your interest in our college. Mrs. Weiss, our secretary for admissions, will be in touch with you soon with the information you desire. Women are welcome in any of our courses, and we would be glad to discuss with you the various programs in which you might be interested. Since you state in your letter that your interest leans specifically to the rabbinate, we would have to inform you candidly that we do not know what opportunities are available for women in the active rabbinate, since we have as yet not ordained any women. Most women prefer to enter the field of Jewish religious education. We would appreciate learning the name of your rabbi so that we may ask him to guide and advise you.
I'd like you to see the series and the progression before we discuss. So we're going to move on. Who would like to take the second letter, which is now the follow-up from the Secretary for Admissions. And this is just a few days later, 1963. Somebody else want to take this one? Barbara, go ahead. Just remember to unmute before you start.
Yeah. Dear Miss Priesand, Rabbi Karasik has told me of your interest in the rabbinate and of the possibility that you may wish to apply to our college. I am sending to you, under separate cover, a copy of our catalog and other literature which will be of interest to you. Perhaps you will want to consult with Rabbi Litt after you have had the opportunity to study the materials we are sending you. You might also ascertain from Rabbi Litt, and he in turn from other rabbis, just what would be the disposition of the rabbinate respecting someone like you who is interested in being ordained by the College Institute. While we have had women students, none so far has taken the full course of study which would lead to graduation and ordination as a rabbi. Therefore, some clear knowledge on your part of what it will mean to you have graduated from our school is essential for you prior to your thinking about entering. The question of a woman as a rabbi is a question for the rabbis rather than for the school. There is no attempt on our part to discourage you, but to direct your thinking. Do keep in touch with us, and if there are other further questions, please do not hesitate to write. Cordially, Mrs. Miriam O. Weiss, Secretary for Admissions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm sure we got lots of reactions and responses. Let's keep going. The following year, February 5th, 1964, this time from the provost, Samuel Sandmel. Who's next? Who else wants to take the next one? I have a hand.
All right, I'll do another one.
Thank you, Barbara.
Okay. Dear Miss Priesand, I am pleased to inform you that we are prepared to admit you as a special student in the undergraduate department of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, enrolled for credit, but not enrolled as a pre-rabbinic student. Your acceptance will become formal as soon as we receive from you written confirmation of this letter and a transcript of your final grades for the current academic year. Our president, Dr. Nelson Gluck.
Actually, it's pronounced Glick.
Glick and the faculty join me in welcoming you to our college. We trust that your stay with us will bring you inspiration and spiritual growth. Cordially, Samuel Sandmel, Provost.
And just FYI, Susan Glick is a member of our congregation, and Nelson Glick was, I think, her grandfather. So a little bit of CBS connection there. Okay, I think there is just one more. This is now February 1964. So is this the year? Yeah, so same year. So same year. And this is the assistant to the provost. Okay, so this is just a responding. Yeah, go ahead, Karen. Take the last one.
In reply to your letter of February 9th to Dr. Sandel, let me assure you that the word special student has no adverse connotation. Since we require all unmarried undergraduate students to live on campus and we do not have housing for women, we must use this term to grant permission for your living elsewhere. I look forward to seeing you in the fall.
Oh, no, I thought I was done, but I'm not quite done. One more. I'll take this one. Dear Sally, I'm pleased to inform you officially that you have been admitted to the Rabbinic School of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. Your admission is contingent upon receipt of official certification of your undergraduate degree. Dr. Glick and the faculty join me in welcoming you and in expressing good wishes for your happiness and fulfillment in your studies in the Rabbinic department. That's May 14th, 1968. And 1972, she finished the program and was ordained. So there's so much there. You know, and I know we're only getting half of the conversation. You can assume that she was incredibly polite and appropriate, and reactions. What do you read between the lines? Yes, Gordon.
Well, I just think about what was happening in our country during that same, it was 62 to 68, right? So, I mean, there was a lot happening in the general culture that would kind of move the needle in terms of where they were at. And I think that, you know, what we're seeing here is just a reflection of where the culture was moving.
Yeah, Bunny.
But just how patronizing, and what the word patronizing and patrimony and patter. I'm not fluent in Latin or even close, but clearly how profoundly and clearly that states what the attitude was.
Yeah, Phil.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, there seemed like there was a gap. The initial letters were 63, 64, and that last one was 68. Was she going to undergraduate school in the interim, or was there?
Yes, I think so. I think she knew it. I think at the end of high school she wanted to go, and she was making these inquiries and trying to sort of to lay out the groundwork right before she, she started that journey before she was ready to actually go into the program. I think that's right.
She really stuck to it, though. They really were sticking it to her, and she's like, "I'm still coming."
She persevered, right? She persevered. Yeah. Barbara.
I was just wondering about those 4 years, thinking that maybe she was waiting till they would agree. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I don't think it was waiting. I think it was preparing, the ground for herself. Yeah, because at no time did they say that, that they weren't ready or come back to us. It was much more subtle than that. Karen.
I mean, unfortunately, some of us know from our history that this was not unique just to the rabbinate. I know in particular to myself, I received a rejection letter from a college who said that, basically I was more qualified than anybody else, but they weren't going to accept me because I was a woman. But that in medical school and residency, it was just expected that the women would sleep in the same room as the male residents. Not that we slept very much, but it was just expected that we would just be in the same room with them. There was no attempt at all at giving us any separation.
Right. So if you'd had an issue with that, then these would have been, things that were impediments to your proceeding. Yeah, Elaine.
Just a funny story. So this started for her in 64. And if we can go back to 1960 or 59, 60, when I told the principal of my Hebrew school that I wanted to be a rabbi. I've shared this story with you, Rabbi. And I was literally patted on the head and said, there, dear, you'll make a wonderful rabbi's wife. So unfortunately, that was a little bit before Sally. So it just, that was a sign of the times.
Yeah, certainly it was. But you should know that it was, if not said outright out loud, although I think it was implied many times to Sally that she was really just there to find herself a rabbi husband. Yeah, that was there was some who held an assumption that she wasn't going to actually graduate and be ordained as a rabbi, that sometime in the interim years she would, marry one of the other students and be the wife of a rabbi. Exactly that. Yeah. So, the whole, the special status, you won't be accepted initially into the rabbinic path. You're going to start with this other thing. I will tell you that, this is a pattern that we saw later on as well. I know, from the women who were, and men, I guess, but the first openly lesbian woman who was ordained as a rabbi in the UK, Rabbi Elisa in the mid-90s. I want to say like maybe 1994, something like that, she was ordained. So the practice at Leo Beck College was that every student was on probation for the first year. And if you did well in that first year, then you got, at that point, officially accepted. And like you're now on track to keep up your studies, and you're now officially on the rabbinic track. But the first year, everyone was in probation, and you weren't officially on the rabbinic track yet. Elisa and another woman who also I think was a student similar time. She was a mature student, an older student. They were told that they would be on probation all 5 years. Because it was a first, and they didn't know how it was going to go. And by the way, very similar narratives to what I saw in the wording of some of these letters. It's very interesting, given the history, that back in 1922, the CCAR said yes to women rabbis in principle, and the college said no. that in these letters, the college says, it's not really for us to decide. We're happy, you can come and study and be a student. We could take you all the way through to the end. We don't know what the rest of your colleagues are going to think of this. That was what was written in between the lines in those mid-60s letters, was that, by implication, and we're not taking responsibility for finding you a job afterwards. We'll train you, but we don't know what the end result will be. We don't know if the rest of the rabbinic world, if your colleagues, if the movement is ready for this. They didn't explicitly put it in that language, but that's what I saw in these letters. And we're not taking responsibility for that. And by the way, that's something that I know, again, has come up certainly even, when I started rabbinic school in 2001, that was a conversation in the reform movement in the UK, which is more like left-wing conservative, so it's more traditionally oriented. There were more people who were being who were applying to the college who were gay and lesbian, and there was this conversation about, well, we don't know if the movement's ready, and the congregations don't want to hire them, and it was, and that was a narrative at the beginning of the 2000s. It's one of the reasons why I didn't come out when I started rabbinic school in London. For 2 years, I led a double life where I was out in the States when I came to this country, and I had all of these friends who kind of in the rabbinic world who sort of helped me find my way. And back home, I wasn't, because I didn't know which way my life was going to go. Suri and I were doing this long distance relationship, and I did not know if there would be a job for me in the UK if I came out at that particular moment in time, even though I had those who had gone before me who did have jobs, but there was what felt like a backlash, given that this is only 6 years after the very first woman who was an out lesbian was ordained, that I started at the college. So yeah, it's, I see in sort of in, and I might be reading in some of my own experience in between the lines of these letters, but I see coded messages that are very similar about, we don't know whether, you're going to get a job at the end of this. And just to give, as I said, I want her to tell her own story, but just to kind of give you briefly what happened. So Sally did get a job out of college. And in fact, as you would, again, championed by someone who wanted to, to be out there as the first. Stephen Wise Temple in New York City, very prestigious New York congregation, hired her as the assistant rabbi in 1972, promoted to her to associate. It wasn't a done deal by any means, but when you've been somewhere, as she was for, I think it was 7 years, and your senior rabbi is coming to retirement, one possibility is that you have trained, the person who's your associate to step into those shoes. It was made very clear to her that the congregation was not going to hire her as the senior rabbi of the synagogue. She left. And for the next couple of years, it was at that moment in time, she was not able to get a senior position at a different congregation, at a smaller congregation, at a less prestigious congregation. She ended up patching together work with a part-time rabbinic job for a congregation in New Jersey, and some chaplaincy work. And again, I want her to tell her story, but I believe that in those 2 years, there was a moment in which she was pretty sort of despondent and might have packed it all in. But she ended up then landing a job at this small young congregation in Monmouth, New Jersey. And that's where she was hired as their rabbi. And that was in 1981. So think about when our congregation hired Rabbi Haken as its, solo senior rabbi. So 1981, Sally was hired, and she spent the rest of her career serving Monmouth Reform Temple. Karen.
I was wondering if those same restrictions were put on gay men who were rabbis or rabbi candidates.
Yes, I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. It wasn't specifically women. It was, yeah.
That makes it better.
I should say, though, again, that there were a number of men and women who were lesbian and gay who had already been ordained, in the 80s. They just went out during, and that's a whole other story in terms of the firsts and the lives they lived and how secretive they were about their private lives. As I said, men, women who were inspirations to me, and I cannot imagine the lives that they were living and what they went through before it was possible to simply to say this is who I am and introduce my partner or introduce my wife and there are still certain parts of the country and certain places where that would write you out of a job, even in this country and even in our movement. But it certainly changed for the better. And in fact, one of the things which is relatively new in our movement is just in the last 2 or 3 years, they have required congregations who are going through placement to say that they have or will be, prior to starting their search process, going through an implicit bias training. So that they have to actually do a workshop that the movement helps to facilitate to bring awareness to their implicit biases, whether it be about gender, sexuality, ethnicity, age. Ageism is another big one. Mature students, some of my good friends at college who were in their late 40s or early 50s when they were ordained had a much harder time getting good jobs and employment as rabbis than I did, for example. I was the right kind of mature student. I was only I was 28 instead of 23. So I had enough life experience that I had a little bit of an edge on the 23-year-olds who had almost no life experience, beyond having been in school all of their life. But there was a big difference between my experience and someone who was 40, just starting out. So ageism is another one. And the placement service now asks search committees to do that thinking before they start. Doesn't rule it all out, but it at least puts it on the table and makes them think about why they think the way they do. So folks, it's almost 9 o'clock. Any burning final thoughts or questions while you think about on that for just a moment? I just want to see if there was, I do have one more thing I would like to share with you, if I may. I'm going to give Sally the final word tonight. It's very brief, just 2 minutes. So if I may. Okay, I just have to take a second to get to the right window that I'm sharing with you. Here it is. Okay. But that was a little rusty. Here we go.
I didn't enter the rabbinate to change Judaism. And I would say that because I went to rabbinic school alone, as the only woman in a class of with 35 men, I did not have the same perspective as other women who are in rabbinic school today, who do it as a class and have their own community. I was alone. I had to remain focused on what I was doing, and I had to be better than everyone else. So that no one could decide to get rid of me because my academic skills weren't up to snuff. So I went into the rabbinate to be a congregational rabbi. And I think one of the ways that the presence of women has changed the rabbinate is that women are more into networking and partnership than are men. Male rabbis, for centuries probably, have been the authority. They look at the hierarchical model of leadership. And I discovered early on that that was not going to be my model, that I wanted to be partners with my congregation. And when I went to Monmouth Reformed Temple, I told them that in my interview. And of course, what that means is that sometimes you lose. Sometimes you have an idea, nobody wants to accept it, and so you have to be gracious about it and bring it back in a few years when maybe you'll have different people who will listen. So I think that women in the rabbinate have enabled men to be more nurturing openly, and I also think that we've had of course, a lot of influence on changing theology, viewpoints of God, prayer books that are being written today.
Well, I said I'd give her the last word, so she has it. And we'll pick up next week. We will be joined by Rabbi Debbie Haken, who will be zooming in from California. And I'm excited to have her add her voice and her story to the journey that we are on together. So thank you all very much. And I'll see you next week.